Hi, everybody. My name is Isha, and my background is in cell and molecular biology, and I have a master's in biotech. And in 2010, I published a paper on producing meat in cell culture, and that led to me becoming the executive director of New Harvest, which I've been doing for the past 2.5 years, where we've been trying to advance animal products made without animals. And so today I'm going to talk about cultured food, which I believe is the new wave in biotechnology. And so I'm going to start by giving a many thousand-year history of biotechnology, but it all fits on one slide. So our very first dabblings in biotechnology were in Neolithic times when we started fermenting foods. And that meant using microorganisms to make yogurt and beer and bread. And what was so awesome about that is when we used microorganisms to transform food, we allowed foods to have much higher shelf life stability. Of course, there were no shelves back then, so I don't know, in your leather pack on your horse or something. You also were able to unlock new flavor landscapes, and we can recognize that when we think there's only one milk, but there's so many different types of cheeses. We also did that to unlock new textures, and we can see that with yogurt as compared to milk. And fermentation was our kind of first introduction to biotechnology, but we continued biotech through food, and that's when we started getting into more of the plant biotech stuff. And plant biotech stuff goes back, way back when, to when we just started choosing what two things we were going to breed with one another. And I put corn here because a lot of people talk about corn in the GMO sense, but here I'm comparing it to this little grass, which is called teosinte, which is a particularly useless grass, which we've since made something extremely useful, and now corn is in so many different foods. Whether you think it's important or not that we eat corn in so many different ways is another thing, but we've turned this really quite useless grass into something that is a major food crop. And then after biotech dabbled in agriculture, and it still is, it went into medicine and addressing different medical needs. And you in the audience said that there are lots of GMOs in pharma, and this is an example. This is insulin, and insulin right now is produced in some kind of bacteria. It's a GMO product, and we inject it into our bodies, which is much more intimate than having to eat something. So that's something to think about. And then biotechnology got into industrial biotech, which was particularly interesting because it was a way for us to move away from a petrochemical-based economy and towards, using crops and using things that grow and degrade to produce chemicals that we are normally getting from fossil fuels. And of course, fossil fuels themselves are kind of bioproducts. They're just millions of year old bioproducts. But now we can make them using different feedstocks and plants and algae and those kind of things. And similarly, industrial biotech also covers using microbes to bioremediate places that have been contaminated by chemicals or contaminated, oil spills and things like that. But what I think is the real next wave in biotechnology is using biotech to solve the many problems that are associated with animal agriculture, which is what this looks like. So this, I think, is a very striking photo because we have all these tiny, tiny dots, which are cows, and they're all contributing to this gigantic lagoon full of waste, which is over-nutrified, and a ton of algae grows there, which means nothing can live there. And that lagoon is basically what the Gulf of Mexico is right now, because all of the runoff through all of the agricultural states has gone through the Mississippi River and made the Gulf of Mexico a complete dead zone. So what I would like to see is biotechnology address the issues that animal agriculture has created. And this number of cows, this is just one feedlot in Texas. What we really need to be thinking about is the global herd, which is what I'm going to be talking about next. We need to be thinking about the global perspective of how many animals we're raising and how that's affecting our planet. So right now we have 7 billion people on this earth, and that means we have 60 billion land animals. This is not including marine animals that we also use. 60 billion land animals that we are using for food and textiles and ingredients and cosmetics and all these little things that we use throughout our day. And that is a lot of animals. And for me, it's kind of hard to fathom what a billion of animals looks like, but I'm going to show you in a couple different ways, so hopefully it will piece together like it did for me. So this image, I think, will show you kind of what the impact of our farmed animals is. So these 5 green dots represent the mass of every wild animal on Earth, including rhinos and elephants and lizards and sloths and naked mole rats and whatever. And that is these 5 dots. And when you think about humans, really taking over the planet, yes, it's true, because all these purple dots represent the mass of humans, which is intense. But then you think about what the mass of farmed animals is, and it's like many, many times that of humans, and many, many, many more times that of wild animals. So this image is really showing you that our farming system is really damaging biodiversity. It's really making our planet a planet of very few species. This is one species, and then these farmed animals and pets is like less than 10 species. So we're really damaging the diversity of our planet by the way we're producing animals right now. Then to go a little bit more into the impact environmentally speaking, I know that we went over this a little bit earlier, but 1/3 of all ice-free land is used towards producing livestock, which is insane to think about. But when you think about it, a lot of the food that we are growing, we're just growing to feed to animals to make it very inefficient to feed ourselves. And that this livestock farming also represents 8% of our global water supply, which is pretty serious when we're considering how scarce water is becoming right now. Livestock farming also represents 18% of all greenhouse gas emissions, which is pretty significant when we consider that this is actually bigger than the global transportation sector. So when we're thinking about our effect on climate change and our effect on our carbon footprint, we should really be thinking about our diets instead of the way we move around. So this is the environmental impact, but I think maybe something that is particularly scary is the threat of antibiotic resistance and how it's related to farm animal production. And this graph shows you how the US uses antibiotics within 1 year. So 13.5 million kilograms of antibiotics, which represents 80% of all antibiotics used in the States, are given to livestock. And they're not given to livestock because the livestock have infections or got their wisdom teeth pulled out. They're given to livestock because it's a preventative measure to prevent them from getting sick, which seems silly because we all know that when you give antibiotics without anyone being sick, it just builds resistance, and it's a particularly dangerous thing. I've read other studies where giving antibiotics can help animals grow faster, so there may be something there too. But it's very, very dangerous, and it's particularly dangerous because these antibiotics are the exact same ones that you and I are using. So when the animals are producing resistance, it will affect us. And when we get to a state where our antibiotics don't work for us anymore, we're basically going back in time to when our life expectancies were much shorter, because when we had a tiny infection, it actually meant our health was, we could die. So it was a very bad thing. And there's another bad thing that is related to us dying, which is epidemics. So when we have animals of such high density packed so closely together, we have a perfect situation for a virus to infect this chicken, mutate to infect this chicken, mutate to infect this chicken, and so on. And then this packed scenario allows the virus to mutate so many times and also to interact with humans such that this virus can infect humans. And we've seen this happen before with swine flu and avian flu. And avian flu was our most recent dabbling with a epidemic virus that came from factory farm. And it was a real serious issue. I mean, for over 1 year, from April 2009 to 2010, 61 million people were infected, and 12,500 people died. And that was a flu that we managed to control and had vaccines sent out and all that kind of stuff. As our density of animals grows and we get animals more and more packed together, the incidence of this happening is going to become more and more frequent. And we will be less and less prepared because we have so many animals for which this virus can mutate. So it's very, very dangerous the way that we're producing animals right now. And of course, antibiotics have nothing to do with preventing a virus evolving. So I want to take a little look into the future and think about, well, what's going to happen from now on? And the way that we're projecting things right now is that our global population is going to grow and our global meat consumption is going to grow as well, which means we're going to need more animals. And that's partially because of our population growing, but it's also partially because, there's countries where there's a growing middle class and people are tending to eat more meat than they used to. So by 2050, we're expecting about 9 billion people and requiring about 100 billion land animals to serve the needs of those 10 billion people. I have no idea how we're going to find the space for that when we already use 1/3 of our land for animal agriculture today. So what are we going to do? And I just wanted to point out with this, a lot of people will tell me, well, meat consumption has leveled off in North America, which it has for the past year and last year. But if we have only one planet, and so if we think about it leveling off in North America, that is more than overcompensated by what is going on in the BRIC nations. So we really have to start thinking about what we're going to do next. So before I start talking about how we should be producing animal products without animals, I'm going to briefly talk about what the trajectory is for animals right now and how we've been basically modifying animals over time. And these modifications are just the result of just choosing which two chickens are going to breed with one another over and over again. And so this was research that was done at my undergrad university at the University of Alberta. And this is a chicken from 1950, which looks a lot like a wild bird, which for us in New York, I guess, means it looks like a pigeon. And this is at 68 days of age, it looks like a bird. And this is the chicken of 2008, which you can see is like a breast machine. It's gigantic, it grows incredibly fast, and this is much younger than the chicken from 1950. So what we've really done is seen how the pressures of North American eating and North American chicken preferences, which is that we like chicken breast, have modified the chicken to just be a chicken breast machine. And of course, the problem with creating a bird, because a bird is a whole organism, and if you change one thing, you're probably likely to change something else. The problem with growing an animal so fast is that its metabolism is extremely fast, which means that it can get hot very easily. And when an organism is too hot, it spends energy cooling itself off instead of turning feed into meat. So there's this problem where we have to think about how we can cool these chickens down so that they will grow more effectively. And when we think about climate change and it getting hotter and stuff, we need to figure out ways to cool these birds down. So a scientist proposed, and this was also created through just simple breeding techniques, that we create a chicken that has no feathers. And I just want to say again that this was not made through some invasive genetic thing. This was just choosing which two birds to mate with one another. And this bird has no feathers, which I suppose means you can pack them closer together because they won't get hot, which I think is, well, anyway, you can think whatever you want to think. But in terms of thinking, like the other chicken being a breast machine, I think this chicken is even more closely related to a rotisserie chicken than the pigeon-type bird that we looked at earlier. So what we're really doing right now is we're moving in this trajectory where chicken is more like chicken from the restaurant than chicken the bird. And I guess I'm thinking, like, how far does this go, and at what point does this end, and what is the ultimate end of this? And I looked at this kind of speculative design project called the Center for Unconscious Farming, where this guy was like, well, what if we just, chickens wouldn't have to suffer, and we wouldn't have to worry about if they're too hot and whatever, if they didn't have a nervous system. And we could just grow them in this like vertical rack, and it could be like very matrixy. And we wouldn't have to worry about the welfare of these animals because we're basically just growing them in these like meat sacks. And I find this, to me, this is not a particularly efficient way to move forward because, well, first of all, you're still growing a whole chicken. We don't really know what the chicken would be feeling inside. And you still have a beak and feathers and all that kind of thing. So to me, I don't think you would get any kind of environmental benefit from it. It would still be resource intensive. it's crappy. And it's also crappy because that's already how we produce chickens today. This is a slaughter plant. Like, in fact, this is probably better because these chickens do know what's going on to a degree. So, all of this background, and what am I really getting at? I'm getting at the fact that if all we want is chicken breast, which is boneless, skinless, and trimmed of fat and has very little resemblance to an animal, why do we have to produce it from the whole organism down when we can produce it from the smallest unit of life, which is the cell, up? Because what we'd really be producing is the exact same thing. It's still a muscle tissue, but instead of having a chicken where we had to cut its beak off so it wouldn't peck the chickens that are right beside it and pull its feathers out and cut this and that and whatever away and waste this and that, we can just start at the chicken cell level and grow upwards and end up with the exact same product and avoid all the issues that are associated with producing an animal, which means not having to worry about it spreading disease, not having to worry about feeding it antibiotics, etc., etc. So this idea is called cultured meat, and this diagram is from a paper that was published in 2003, which is really the first modern day paper that references the idea of producing meat from the cell up. And I thought I'd go through a brief overview of how we would even do such a thing. So the first thing, really it just requires 4 elements. The first thing would be cells. And so if you're producing chicken, you get cells from a chicken. If you're producing beef, you get cells from a cow, et cetera, et cetera. And presumably they would be muscle cells because you're trying to grow muscle tissue. And I suppose we could get into organ tissues and skin and fat and that kind of stuff too, but primarily it will be muscle tissue. And muscle cells are particular in that they need to be adhered onto a surface in order to mature and turn into a proper muscle fiber. So you would need some kind of scaffold for that muscle cell to attach onto and so it could mature. So that scaffold could be beads, it could be long noodles, it could be big sheets. It's basically anything that can provide a lot of surface area for these muscle cells to attach onto. And the scaffold could also be something that actually is incorporated into the end meat product, or it could be something that is removed from it in the end. There's a lot of options there. And then the cells attached onto the scaffold, you need to put in a medium. And if we were to parallel this with meat production, the medium would be like the blood of an animal. It brings all the nutrients to the cells, it brings oxygen to the cells, and it removes the waste products and removes any kind of carbon dioxide, et cetera, that the cells don't require. And then this whole process takes place in a bioreactor, which is essentially a body, which similarly maintains a regular temperature, allows waste products to be removed and inputs to go in, and it basically is the vessel in which these cells can multiply and grow. And this is not just theoretical pie in the sky stuff. This has actually been done, and this literally is a burger that was produced in cell culture, and it was tasted in August of 2013. It cost a lot of money. It cost $300,000 to produce that burger. But when you think about the very first of anything, I mean, this is quite reasonable by comparison. And I wanted to point out the way this burger was created. So in the beginning, the researcher was just suspending a muscle fiber basically between 2 pieces of Velcro. And so the muscle fiber would stretch between the Velcro so that it could mature into a muscle fiber. But towards the end of creating the burger, which took a long time, they found out that if you put a cylinder of gel in a petri dish and seeded muscle cells around it, the muscle cells would eventually grow to form this ring, and just innately within the muscle cell, they would start contracting around the gel, which was basically like exercising the muscle fiber, and it matured into a muscle fiber in these tiny ring forms, which is probably the most novel thing that came out of the burger, because when you think about it, making a cell multiply is not a particularly novel thing. But the fact that it's not a novel thing is really interesting to me, because it means that if one company or one person figures out a way to produce meat in cell culture, there will be many, many workarounds. So we have this opportunity to really create a whole new industry of meat production, which is far different from the monopoly that exists with meat production today. I didn't want to talk just about meat. I wanted to talk about all kinds of animal products to show that, you know, this is actually a whole new industry. This is like the biofuels thing. It's more than just meat. It's more than one product. This is a company in Brooklyn that is producing leather in cell culture, and what he's holding there is a piece of cell-cultured leather. New Harvest has spawned a company that is producing milk produced in cell culture. The milk is not quite the same as meat because it's not tissue. There's no living stuff in milk. It's just proteins and fats. So you can use the same system that produces insulin, for example, to produce milk proteins. And they don't have to be so sterile that you have to inject, but they probably would be anyway. Another company that New Harvest has spawned is this company called Clara Foods. And this is, you know, not a particularly delicious photo, but this is a egg white that was being produced without chickens. And the reason why I wanted to show this unappetizing photo is to show how exciting it is that we can be part of food science with this type of food science because a nonprofit is leading it. And I think that's a very, very exciting thing, particularly because when we think about how GMOs came to be, the first GMO was approved it got FDA approval in 1994, and the first official Right to Know campaign was in 2004. So 10 years had passed of us just eating these things, and we had no idea what was going on. And that isn't to say that what was going on was particularly bad, but, you know, we're consumers. It's nice to be informed, and I think it's nice to be able to see what our food science looks like in its development. So that's the farmed animal stuff, and I also wanted to talk about another company we're working with called Pampiant. And this little blob is a rhino horn that is being produced in cell culture as a means to end poaching, which is a kind of a different take on the animal thing, but also very exciting. So I wanted to talk a little bit about where this is headed, because when I tell people that there's a burger that costs $300,000, it's like, well, okay. But what is exciting is that biotech is moving very, very quickly in terms of process optimization and being able to produce things at very low cost. And when we think about the global limits that I mentioned earlier that we're facing with livestock production, the price of meat can literally only go up because we only have so much planet left. And we have only so many culls of chickens that need to occur that will keep driving the price of meat up. So beef, pork, and chicken, the price is only going to go up over time. And similarly, for these cell culture products, which don't require so much land, which don't require so much water, which don't require all these inputs, the price of them can only come down. And I think that's a very compelling argument. Similarly, I kind of wanted to point out some similarities between the way animal agriculture happens today and the way we kind of change things in energy. So in the past, coal production was the animal agriculture of today. It was ugly, it was very ineffective, it was very dirty and bad for the environment. And since then, we have come up with a diversified system where we're producing energy in many, many different ways. And so when you have this diversity, you really create a system that is much more resilient to change. So say in the future, when we're producing meat in many different ways, plant-based meats and meat through small-scale farms and meat through, maybe there's also still industrial farming, and meat through cell culture, if there's ever a gigantic outbreak that wipes out everything in industrial agriculture, we still have this in our back pocket. Similarly, if it's not a windy day, we have solar energy. This diversification offers a lot of resilience, and the way that our animal agriculture is framed right now is the opposite of resilient. It's very prone to being wiped out right now. And I don't know if anyone has been following the avian flu that has been spreading through the U.S., but I think the number of chickens that have been affected as of today is like 21 million chickens across 13 states. That's chickens that need to be just completely destroyed. That's just bad business. we used to fund, or we are funding research, and we funded some research that happened at Oxford University, and it was still peer-reviewed and everything, and it looked at how animal agriculture's environmental impacts would compare with the environmental impacts of producing meat in cell culture. And this was basically what happened, and this is comparing to beef. If we produce beef in cell culture, it would require 99% less land, because we could start producing vertically. We wouldn't have to deforest the Amazon to grow soy to ship to China to grow cows. It would require 96% less water. It would produce 96% fewer greenhouse gases and require 45% less energy. And these are all very meaningful numbers when we're reaching a point where there are serious planetary limits that we're approaching. So I kind of wanted to give some visions of what this cultured future would look like, or the future of producing animal products in cell culture. And I'll start that by presenting a word that first came up in 2011 by a journalist, which is the carnery. So if beer is brewed in a brewery and bread is made in a bakery, wine from a winery, then meat would be produced from a carnery. So I thought that was a kind of interesting word. But then I thought about the beer and brewery situation and realized that these are bioreactors. These are the kind of bodies that I was telling you before. It's a controlled environment. Temperature is controlled, there's inputs, there's outputs, but the person who runs this is perceived as an artisan and a craftsperson, and not as a mad scientist. And that's very significant, because this is a food facility, and it's very high tech, and we perceive it as so awesome that this guy is making this particular type of beer in this particular brewery. And I want you to note that there are people in the brewery, and there are no people in factory farms right now. In fact, there's laws to prevent people from being in factory farms right now. Further to that, we like having breweries in the place where we eat food. Like, we actually like observing this. No one is eating at a restaurant with like a glass wall overlooking a slaughterhouse. And I guess to go further with the brewing idea is the fact that, instead of these meats being produced, or these animal products being produced just in, industrial type settings, although I would say this is more like a small scale artisanal type of thing, there is the possibility that we could be producing our own cell cultures at home. So if there are in fact so many workarounds, so many different cell types to begin with, so many different mediums to feed those cell types, so many different scaffolds, etc., so many different bioreactor designs, there's no reason why there couldn't be a DIY movement of people culturing cells themselves and producing their own milk at home, or producing their own meat at home. And in some ways, this is kind of hearkening back to the times when we did in fact do those things, but with whole animals. So I'm going to end with the reality, which is that burger was produced like this. And the reality is that this research is not going to be progressing unless we support it. And the issue right now is that this particular type of science is basically using knowledge that we've gained in medical research and applying it to agricultural applications. And because it's so multidisciplinary, it's a real challenge to get funding towards this type of research. So that is really why New Harvest exists, and why I've dedicated my 2.5 years until indefinitely to making sure that we can push more funds and more opportunity in the way of this research, because I think if the public gets involved, we can really steer the way these products can go, rather than kind of putting them in the hands of a monopolizing type of organization. So that is the end of my presentation.